So we're going to bring in now Carmen Cruz. Carmen Cruz is a New York City public school teacher. We've talked a lot about how we do our educator learning tours, and we've done 3 so far. We have 2 more coming this year. When we started that program last October, we intended for it to occur annually, 1 time a year. It was so powerful that we decided to do it as much as possible. And so with those educators, we give them full scholarships. They apply from all over the country. And on this last journey that occurred 2 weeks ago, we had educators from 13 states and 3 different countries, the United States, Canada, and Haiti. When we put out the call for educators to come and teach, we had an overwhelming response. And one of those educators is Carmen Cruz. And Carmen, I love the title. You said the other San Juan Hill. So I'm going to turn it over to you so you can start to educate us. Thank you, Carmen.
Excellent. I just want to say thank you for inviting me to that learning tour. Something that you had said during the tour really resonated with me, where we were experiencing these different journeys, and you had told us that you can't go back and not do this work. Like, there's no possible way that you can go back and not engage in the work, because once you see it and once you live it, it's within you. And I really appreciate you saying that. I will share my screen now so that we can see my presentation. All right. And so my name is Carmen Cruz, and we're talking today about the other battle for San Juan Hill. And really what we're talking about is the impact of legislation on Black and Brown communities. Usually with my students, we talk about the goals for the day. So the goal for today is to unpack how legislation impacted and continues to impact communities of color, and to learn the story of San Juan Hill in Manhattan and its shared experiences with other communities of color. So San Juan Hill is a neighborhood that once existed in Manhattan, and it was located right at the center of Manhattan to the west of Central Park, all the way down to the Hudson River. It's currently known as Lincoln Square, and it was a predominantly African-American community. And so in 1945, post-World War II, there becomes a migration of Puerto Rican people from their island to Manhattan, and they begin to move into San Juan Hill. So there's a growing Puerto Rican population, and there's also a really small Italian population. Interesting fact, West Side Story was filmed in San Juan Hill, and it actually did represent the tension that existed between the Italian and Puerto Rican communities. Unfortunately, what that movie didn't do was show the population of the Black people that existed within that neighborhood, almost as though it was like the first example of its erasure. But there was a legacy left behind. San Juan Hill had a vibrant jazz culture. We had some of the greats like Thelonious Monk and James P. Johnson, performing in San Juan Hill. It was very similar to Harlem in that way. So why are we talking about it? Because San Juan Hill does not exist anymore. And for us to understand that, we have to really look at the U.S. Housing Act of 1949. And the reason why we're looking at this act is because it allowed for communities that were not contributing to the growth of bigger cities to be recreated. And so what happens in the language of this document that we see here, which is the Housing Act of 1949, is we see the repeated use of the framing of clearance of slums, right? So it's used repeatedly, and that's in reference to any community that is not contributing to the growth of the and so we're talking about this because Dr. Terry Ann Scott talked yesterday, and these facially neutral laws are laws that are not discriminatory in language, but they are discriminatory in the impact, right, and the intention. And so when we look at this language of the clearance of slums, we have to consider which neighborhoods are being hit. What ultimately they target brown neighborhoods. San Juan Hill is one of them. Now, I don't want to just paint the just one picture of San Juan Hill. It was a very vibrant, beautiful community. It wasn't always that way. So early on, late 1800s, and that was because there was very limited to no care on the lower side. And she decides, I want to support all Black communities. And so she travels through Manhattan and she comes across San Juan Hill. And she decides that she wants to support them and help them with their access to healthcare. What happens is she's pushed away. The people of San Juan Hill did not want her help. They had a hard time trusting her. And so she goes back to her boss, Lillian Wald, at a settlement in the Lower East Side. And she says to her boss, we have to support these people. And so they together get some funding and create the Stillman House settlement. And this settlement was built in San Juan Hill, and it was built to support the people of San Juan Hill and support their access to healthcare. And so the images you see are after this is built. And this action allows the community to begin to thrive. So this is in 1900. So late 1800s, it was a little bit of a slum. Then in 1900, they have access to healthcare, and we see that the neighborhood begins to grow. Additionally, we have Union Baptist Church that is built in 1901. Many historical documents refer to it as Building 202 because it wasn't just used as a church. It was kind of a multi-purpose building. Whatever the neighborhood needed at the time is what they got. So some documents name that it was used as not just a place of worship, but a daycare, a music school, whatever the neighborhood needed is what this building offered for them. So with that and the support of healthcare with Elizabeth Tyler, we're seeing that this neighborhood begins to flourish. Ultimately, in the end of the 1940s, I believe it was 1947, Robert Moses declares that San Juan Hill is a slum. And he makes a demand for urban renewal. The people push back toward Robert Moses, and they tell him that they do not live in a slum. And in fact, they take this framing of urban renewal and they tell him what you're trying to do is urban removal. You're trying to remove people of color from this neighborhood. So just name it for what it is. What I want us to do, the English teacher in me, is telling us to look at this word slum. Right? So we have a filthy, overcrowded urban street inhabited by very poor people. And so what I want us to do is what we see in San Juan Hill. I'm going to show you a series of photos, and we're going to really look and see if this was an accurate description of the neighborhood. And so as we look through some of these photos, we are seeing, families, people within the community, out on the streets. We're seeing very clean streets. We're not seeing this overpopulation or overcrowded description, right? This particular photo, I can walk outside right now. I'm in New York. I can walk outside right now and see something that looks just like this, right? We don't see that there are these uninhabitable houses. What we see is that there is a working class community, right? And so all of these images just show us that this was in fact not a slum. And this was in fact a very thriving community. We see people that are happy, people that are smiling. We have some really great artists that came from San Juan Hill. The Charleston was born in San Juan Hill, right? And so it contributed a lot to the culture of Manhattan. If you were interested in any of the photos, there's a QR code there if you'd like to scan and learn more about any of those particular photos. But if we jump back to this definition, we didn't see overcrowding. We didn't see very poor people that could not inhabit, the community. Nevertheless, Robert Moses declares that it is a slum, and the Lincoln Center project begins. And so what happens is 18 city blocks are leveled. More than 7,000 Black and brown families are displaced. Okay. And we're seeing 800 businesses removed. And while 4,400 new housing units were built in its place, the residents said they could not afford that housing. So they were permanently removed to other places in Manhattan and the South Bronx. During the groundbreaking ceremony for the Lincoln Center project, Robert Moses was asked by a reporter how he feels about displacing more than 7,000 Black and brown families. And this is what he said. You cannot rebuild a city without moving people any more than you can make an omelet without breaking eggs. That is what he said at the removal of 7,000 Black and brown families. You cannot rebuild a city without moving people any more than you can make an omelet without breaking eggs. In that same interview, he calls the neighborhood of San Juan Hill a filthy Puerto Rican slum. And what he does in that framing is two things. One, he builds off of the hatred of the incoming Puerto Rican community in Manhattan. And he also starts the erasure of the Black community. San Juan Hill was first a Black community, and he completely disregarded their existence in that framing. And it's not isolated to just that one neighborhood. It continued over and over again. Black and brown neighborhoods within New York City completely replaced, using the same Housing Act to say, we're going to remove this slum and build something nice and pretty that makes a lot of money. And that's what they did repeatedly. The most recent one, Atlantic Yards, is actually still under construction. It's still happening today. There's this quote from The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein that I'd like to share that describes this. And it says, if you inquire into the history of the metropolitan area in which you live, you will probably find ample evidence of how the federal, state, and local governments unconstitutionally used housing policy to create or reinforce segregation in ways that still survive. These facially neutral laws that still allow government agencies to target communities of color. And it's still happening. It's still happening, and not just in New York City. The most notable example I could think of is in the city of Miami, the neighborhood of Overtown. Predominantly African-American community, it was called the Harlem of the South. They had the famous Lyric Theater, which had performers like B.B. King, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong. And due to the Federal Highway Act of 1956, they constructed a highway right through the city of Overtown, displacing thousands of Black families. And I want you to see what this looks like. I want you to look at this image. At the top, you see Overtown in 1958, and at the bottom, you see Overtown in 2022. And it is just jaw-dropping at how different this community looks after that highway is built. Complete city blocks removed. These were all homes. And this is happening today. This is happening again today because developers would like land in Overtown. And the reason this is happening is because of global warming. Along the coast of Miami, the sea level is rising. And that's causing developers to move inland, and Overtown is the perfect location for them. So what developers are doing is they're buying land in Overtown today. This is a screenshot from yesterday on one of those websites that shows you rent in communities, and we have rents for upwards of $2,000 a month. The average annual household income in Overtown is $38,912. So as these developers are coming in and building in Overtown, they are not necessarily making it so that the people of Overtown can continue to live there.
Now, I did have a question. And so what do you see as the importance of teaching this history locally in a way, right, to students in New York City? And by implication, what teaching similar stories in Overton, Overtown and the like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to students in those communities, sort of local history that's part of a national story?
I think sometimes we become a bit passive when things are so close to us. And so I had mentioned one of the examples being Atlantic Yards. And that one hits close to home because it's literally right outside my home. And I was 2 blocks away from that radius that they were looking at to declare eminent domain. And it makes me think of all the communities that our students live in, that are impacted daily. And so we have moments where we are in the classroom with our students and we allow ourselves to be in that safe space. But we also have to open ourselves up to the fact that they are not always in safe spaces. So how can we allow this to be a forum to talk about what's happening at home, to talk about what happens when students are displaced, or when their communities are displaced. And a colleague had asked me, why did I choose this topic? And the truth is, it's because so many times we see that there are these neighborhoods that are changing and gentrifying. And that's what we do. We say, oh, it's gentrification. Now it's time to move on to the next community. And maybe it's time we say no. And maybe it's time we say, let's not label this gentrification and move on. Let's find ways to preserve our cultures within the neighborhoods that we are already residing in. Because I've seen so many people be pushed out of just my neighborhood alone. And there's no education behind it. We don't understand why. We just feel like we're being pushed out without necessarily having a reason behind it. And I think teaching our students this, it allows them to be informed. And then with that information, they can take action.
Can I follow up on that, on the question there, Carmen? The ability to show the visuals of now and then is just jarring, right? It's horrifying is what it is. And I have seen those in different cities and it's just such a similar pattern. What exactly does happen to the people that are living in those spaces when what exactly does happen to them?
I think about how it demoralizes those who remain. I think about how those who are forced to leave kind of feel like this is what it is. Our people are moved again. But those who remain, I think about the trauma that they must face in watching an erasure around them and then thinking, when am I next? And we've seen it so often in other areas. We've seen it so often with gun violence. We've seen it with other topics of, just having our students and the people around us in our community say, am I next? But the same is true of housing and watching our communities disappear. We watch the changing around us and the trauma that happens when you wonder, am I the last one left? Is really jarring to me. And it's something that I definitely feel where I live, because it is happening around me. And so you can do one of two things. You can feel entirely powerless, which is the easiest thing to do, feel powerless and then just move on. But I think it's time we take action and we move on in a different way and we move on with our actions, and we reclaim that power, because it's ours for the taking if we want it.
Carmen, I grew up just a few blocks from where I think you are, so over in Crown Heights, not too far from Eastern Parkway and Nostrand Avenue. And growing up my family moved there in 1980, 1982. It was an all-Black community, African-American and Caribbean. And my parents were social workers. Bought a house, for their 2 boys. And, by the mid 1990s, that spillover, the gentrification from Lower Manhattan began, and the slow expulsion of senior citizens, of the people who lived in that community when it was really tough to live in because of the crack epidemic and the like, who held that community together, to see them slowly pushed out So that now my parents who are still there, who still live in that same house, been living there for 40 years, they're one of the few remaining Black families on that block. And so while they're still in the house, when I return to Brooklyn and I go to the house, it's a house, but it's not a home because the community doesn't exist anymore. And I think that's one of the lasting effects of that kind of gentrification and expulsion regarding sort of housing, right? Like, of course, everybody wants safe streets and wants, grocery stores that they can go to that have fresh fruit, but there has to be a way to provide that, not just for the upwardly mobile, the rich and the wealthy, right? And those who can afford it. It has to be a way to provide the same for everybody, no matter where they are. So that trauma, I think, really lasts on a lot of different levels, not only for those who remain behind, for those who are forced out, and for those who come back and they're like, my home is no longer there.
We're gonna move to our next speaker, but Carmen, really appreciate the strength of you to go back to the job, to the work, and to double down. And we're fortunate to have spent some time with you, and I look forward to our next trip together.
Thank you.